In the northeast of Avistan, there is a vast cold northern lake called the Lake of Mists and Veils. The lake is formed of glacier water from the crown of the world, which pools at the northern edge of the world and then becomes the source for the mighty Selin River that floods through so much of the river kingdoms further south. And because of the almost impassable nature of the crown of the world, this vast body of water has served as a hub of trade and transportation for the northeastern nations of the Inner Sea. Because of its enormous size, in fact, the Lake of Mists and Veils heavily influences much of the weather of the surrounding lands, with great fogs rolling up off the banks of the lake and freezing rains and snow coming down from the north and crossing the lake in the winter. This important water feature in northeastern Avistan is bordered by the crown of the world in the north, by the nation of Mendev in the west, by Numeria in the southwest, by Brevoy in the southeast, and by the nation of Iobaria in the east. A nation which doesn't appear on the Inner Sea world map at all, in fact, since it's actually part of the continent of Casmarin, which lies east of Avistan, which is why I'm having to switch to a different regional map for this video. There are a few other nations that are significant in this region as well. The nation of Old Sarkoris, now often called the Sarkoris Scar, or simply the Worldwoun, lies just west of Mendev. This nation had the impact of transforming the nation of Mendev into a nation of crusaders after the opening of the Worldwoun just over 100 years ago. The river kingdoms, as mentioned, feeds on the runoff from the lake and lies to the south of Numeria and Brevoy. Also adjacent to parts of the western Selin are the nations of Ustalav and Razmir in the southwest. Finally, south of Brevoy is an inhospitable region called the Windswept Wastes that creates a rough border between much of Avistan and Casmarin in the east. In this video, I will discuss three of the nations that border the Lake of Mists and Veils because they broadly have a shared history. Those are the kingdoms of Mendev, of Brevoy, and of Iobaria. The largely Kelid kingdoms of Numeria and Sarkoris will get their own deep dive videos, and Ustalav and the river kingdoms already have deep dive videos of their own up on the channel already. Mendev, Brevoy, and Iobaria are not only physically close to one another, but they also have a shared cultural and ethnic background. All three nations are populated primarily by the Iobarian people, not unlike the Kievan Rus of our real world, who were the ethnic precursors to many Ukrainian and Russian peoples today, and who were ruled over by Scandinavian Viking lords in the Middle Ages. The Iobarians of Galarian were originally an Eastern Avistinian, or Western Casman people, who were colonized by Ulfin occupiers who came to the land over the crown of the world 4,000 years ago, eventually leading to the mixed-race modern Iobarians, who often show a varied mix of both Eastern and Western features. In fact, because of their mixed heritage, Iobarians rarely identify as a single ethnicity, instead identifying themselves according to narrower family lineages, and it's typically only outsiders that view Iobarians as a single ethnic group. Regardless, over the next 1,000 years, various events would cause Iobarians to settle in other nations bordering the Great Lake, driven by various events in their history. Following the spread of a deadly disease called the Choking Death, for example, many Iobarians settled in great numbers on the eastern shores of the Lake of Mists and Veils, a land that was previously populated mainly by Sarkorian Kelids, and they would eventually form the nation of Mendev there. Meanwhile, the kingdom of Brevoy was once the furthest northern and eastern reaches of the Empire of Taldor, until in 4499 the great Iobarian warlord Corral the Conqueror came west to conquer Brevoy and create a new nation there as well. Today, all three of these nations maintain close cultural and commercial ties, and while they are each unique in their own right, it makes sense to cover some of the shared history in a single deep dive video. Of course, as I like to do, let's go all the way back, before any of these human nations were established, to before the Earthfall Cataclysm, and talk about the region's pre-human history. The history of northeastern Avistan. The start of our regional history will take us far afield. During the Age of Serpents, which lasted an immensely long time and covered much of Galarian's prehistory, roughly from minus 15,000 AR to minus 7,000 AR, there was a great and powerful Cyclops Empire in northern Garand, and the heart of its civilization was in the Shackles, a wide archipelago that will get its own regional deep dive video in the future. However, as you may know from watching my regional deep dive video on the nation of Geb, the Cyclops Empire stretched all the way across Garand, and Golgan ruins can be found along the eastern coast of Garand as well. At some point during the Age of Serpents, a group of Golgan were exiled, and they set sail from the eastern coast of Garand, eventually settling on another archipelago, this one located on the west coast of Casmarin, a region known as Iblidos. This group established a new Cyclops kingdom, headquartered in Iblidos, and it was called the Kingdom of Coloran. The Coloran Cyclops would in time circumnavigate the inhospitable Maraz Desert by way of the Kellish Highlands and discover the Castrovan Sea. As a seafaring people who favored island and coastal settlements, the Coloran Cyclops embraced the Castrovan Sea as their own private ocean, hidden away from the rest of the Golgan Empire, allowing them to spread their own culture without fear of running afoul of their brethren. Coloran Cyclops structures can be found all along the coastlines of the Castrovan Sea, but nowhere can they be found in greater density than in the area of modern-day Iobaria, the northern reach of their empire. Their ancient cities in the region included the vast port cities Radiniris along the Mirfors River, and its inland nearby sister city of Mavradia. But their very greatest city they built all the way north, beyond the Castrovan Sea on the Lake of Mists and Veils itself. This was the site of the modern city of Orlov. In time, they would also construct the massive temple city of Kyria, located in the peaks above the Cirzemian Mountains, perhaps their greatest architectural achievement. They also constructed a number of watchtowers, including Kask Kirothar, Hask Ulthuran, and Orostros, the Watching Star, which is now a burned-out structure known as Fralros, the Charred Watchtower. In addition to their various outposts, the Coloran Cyclops created a few more unusual structures. Oroskir, also known as the Opal Island, is a strange opalescent dome that rises from the waters of the Nyveard Lake. They also carved a great eye into the tallest mountain in the Cirzemian Mountains, its lone decorated peak towering above all of its peers, and it is commonly called Orosknir, the Eye Mount. This eye flashes with unknown magical energies every few decades, and locals have long suspected that these energies are somehow related to Iobaria's frequent ills. Finally, there is the Maw of Karth. Built in the Ice-Rime Peaks, this separates Iobaria from continental Avistan. The Maw of Karth is a massive fanged skull carved into the mountains, towering over two neighboring peaks to create a gate. With Karth's tongue as stairs and fangs as side rails that connect a massive stone doorway to the Coloran roads, it is so awe-inspiring that many creatures that dwell in the mountains see Karth as a terrestrial incarnation of an actual god. Connecting all of their cities and various monuments, the Cyclops constructed the Coloran roads. The Coloran roads were a network of ancient stone roads spanning the ancient empire. First discovered by Ulfin explorers, these roads are still used today, as the only means to traverse Iobaria's more dangerous regions, such as the Fangard Forest or the Grenalf Plateau, and they continue to provide the sole means of reaching the city of Kyria. Also, in this pre-Earthfall time, the Elves first came to Galarian, and as is their preference, they built homes for themselves in various woodlands and forests across the Inner Sea region. In northeastern Avistan, they settled in the Estrovian forest, and there they befriended the Sarkorian Kelids, who lived in small druidic communities in the Estrovian. One particularly sophisticated group of Sarkorians had built a holy site for themselves, dedicated to the Sarkorian god Igrir Skymane, a place that they called Timal. Timal was discovered by a group of elven scouts who had come exploring the northern woodlands. Among these Kelids, the elves witnessed the Sarkorian practice of god-calling, and a small group of elven scholars settled in the small settlement to watch and study the phenomena. Timal was built on a high stone cliff jutting up from the dense surrounding woodlands. A winding and dangerous footpath was the only way to reach it initially, but once the elves started to settle there as well, their addition of an elf gate, known as the Eidolon Gate, which connected it directly to the elven capital Yadara in Keonin, meant that it grew fairly rapidly into a prosperous settlement, and this place of elven and Kelid cooperation remains one of the most ancient and best preserved sites of pre-Earthfall human architecture in the world. When the elves of Timal received early warning of the coming Earthfall apocalypse, they were offered the chance to retreat to Sovirian. However, because this offer was only extended to the elves of the town's Kelid residents became enraged. They charged through the Eidolon Gate and into the city of Yadara. In response, the Keonan government sealed the gate, leaving the residents of the town to deal with Earthfall on their own. This ended friendly Kelid and elven relations in the land. The Kelids claimed the city, and the elves fled. Some likely managed to make their way to Keonin on foot before the cataclysm, while others scattered across the land, possibly becoming Ilverani or Drow or other types of the remaining elves. In minus 5293, the Earthfall cataclysm did occur as the elves predicted. When the Starstone crashed into Galarian, it not only kicked up a massive cloud of dust and dirt that covered the world in darkness, but those events also had an effect on the Cyclops of both the Golgan and Coloran empires, cursing the survivors of the cataclysm with a dulled mind and a painful memory of something both lost and forgotten that scratches forever at the edges of their minds. For more details on the modern Cyclops descendants of the Golgan and the Coloran, see my Giants Creature Feature video, which contains a section on the Cyclops. After the cataclysm, it took a long time for anything approaching civilization to return to the region. In fact, humanity would not emerge as the dominant culture in Iobaria. Instead, after the downfall of the Cyclops Empire, the dominant emergent people in the region would be the Centaurs, whose hearty stamina and ability to cover great distances in search of food gave them a natural advantage in the cold, harsh climate of the northern land. Iobaria's steppes, hills, and forests served as the home of three recognized groups of centaurs: the Azorva, the Reshalka, and the Tsolniva. The Azorva are mountain and highland centaurs, stockier and stronger than the norm, and of darker skin and coat hues. They dominated the mountains and highlands of Iobaria. The Reshalka are fair-haired centaurs, and were the most numerous of the Iobarian centaurs in the west and all across the south, ranging from Okor's Basin to the Semarin Plains. The remaining territories belong to the Tsolniva centaurs, who are the most hirsute of the centaurs, with the hair on their torsos nearly as thick and long as the coats covering the rest of their bodies. In minus 4987, the dwarf king Targath breached the surface of the world in a place now called the Five Kings Mountains in south-central Avistan, completing the long-prophesied fulfillment of the quest for the sky. Of course, this was only the beginning of the dwarf emergences, and many other clans of dwarves would find various other paths to the surface, from the southern reaches of Garand to the northern reaches of Avistan. In northeastern Avistan, the largest dwarf tribe to emerge and begin to settle in the surface was the Golka clan, which settled in and around the Golushkin Mountains. The mountains are filled with a great deal of natural resources, such as iron, nickel, copper, silver, and tin. The resources are mined by the Golka clan of dwarves, who live in the dwarven city of Golushkin, deep beneath the surface. In addition to various underground settlements in the mountains themselves, the Golka dwarves also established the surface settlement of Hydelv. In minus 4363, the Reign of Stars occurred. In that year, the Divinity, a spaceship from the planet Androffa, crashed into Galarian, breaking apart and burning through the atmosphere and falling in pieces across Numeria. Some fragments were the size of a fist, while others were as large as towns. The largest piece, known today as the Silver Mount, fell near the future capital city of Starfall, and the city itself derives its name from this event. In minus 3923, the Pit of Gormuz opened up in central Casmarin, at a place located more or less directly south of the Castrovian Sea. This event caused such terrific shockwaves that the southern coastline of Iobaria experienced hurricanes and flooding for several years after this event. In minus 1281, some ways to the south, Aradin, the last Aslanti, would help the first emperor Taldaris found the Empire of Taldor. More details on these events can be seen in my Taldor Deep Dive video. In the year 1, the Age of Enthronement begins. Aradin would become the first of the ascended human gods, by raising the Starstone from the seafloor, founding the city of Absalom, and becoming the patron deity of Taldor. And it wouldn't be long before the Empire of Taldor would grow in power and prosperity, and would eventually expand to the point of impacting the lands of northeastern Avistan. In fact, as early as the year 37, Taldor had initiated its first great army of exploration, which began its conquest of many of the lands north of Taldor, including the entirety of the modern river kingdoms, halting their advance only when they reached the borders of the savage Kelid tribes of Numeria. In 499, the Taldans began to push west around Lake Carthan in the heart of Avistan, conquering the lands that would one day become Ustalav. Taldans were not the only people in this period that developed imperialist ambitions. As discussed in my Lands of the Linorm Kings Deep Dive video, in 752, Ulfin settlers came over the crown of the world and discovered the Lake of Mists and Veils. They established their first settlement at Okormir, on the northern side of the Iobarian Bay. By the following year, these Ulfin explorers discovered the Coloran roads, and began building the city of Orlov among the ruins of an old Cyclops city across the bay. Despite Ulfin settlement in the region, they were not colonizers in the same way the Taldans were, as they lacked a unifying vision, and just as it had been in their homeland, the Ulfin settlers soon divided among themselves into conflicting groups of thanes with no single king to unite them. Regardless, the city of Orlov expanded rapidly, soon becoming a trade hub in the region. The city connected with the Sarkorians across the lake, as well as with the Taldans in the south by way of the Selen River. More Ulfin settlers arrived each year, as well as local indigenous humans, who flocked to the cities from across this land to make their fortunes in the growing towns of Orlov and Akormir, and they were welcomed by the Ulfin settlers, who needed more hands to grow their regional interests. From the Ulfin settlers, the indigenous humans acquired many of the Ulfin ways and traditions, especially when it came to the construction of homes and buildings. Ulfin longhouses and thatched roof homes became common not just in Ulfin settled areas, but across the entire region as a whole. In this early period, northern human merchants and travelers of both Ulfin and indigenous descent, using Orlov as a base of operations, began to settle in the surrounding areas, especially the wide unclaimed reaches north of the Gnarl Marches, which the Taldans had not yet occupied, and which would eventually form the kingdom of Brevoy. By 764, the city of Orlov became larger than Akormir, effectively becoming the capital of a new Ulfin kingdom. The great distance that separated the Linorm kingdoms from the emerging Iobarian kingdom meant that this group was slowly developing their own distinct culture, and mixing between the native peoples and the Ulfin settlers, who didn't have the same superior attitude the Taldans had in their conquered lands, meant that a new people, distinct from both the Ulfin settlers and the indigenous human tribes, had already begun to emerge here. These, of course, would become the Iobarian people of today. Between the years 780 and 846, this new emergent human polity of mixed Ulfin and indigenous people continued to build wealth and influence for themselves, establishing many additional cities in the mainland. The cities of Orost, Antal, Lenusia, Mishkar, Kirosuli, and Kiria were founded in the lands east of the Ice Rimes. The cities of Winterbreak, Port Ice, and Eagle's Watch in the northern reaches of the unsettled lands north of the Taldan Empire would also be established in this time period, along with a number of other small forts and outposts along the way to the Taldan border. The land was not truly united in any common way, but each city had its own thane, and was governed independently as a single city-state, though the most influential of these was Thane Kjell of Orlov, as Orlov was the most powerful city in the region. Meanwhile, in the south, between 861 and 896, the Whispering Tyrant emerged and conquered much of the Taldan lands west of Numeria. When the Whispering Tyrant was finally defeated, the Taldans ceded the land west of Numeria to the Varisian nomads of that region, thus forming the kingdom of Ustalav. More details on this can be seen in my Ustalav deep dive video. In the year 905, Thane Kjell passed rulership of Orlov to his son Iobar, as he was growing older and suffered from various ailments. Iobar was not as content as his father had been with the status quo. He envied the power of the united Taldans in the south, and sought to create a united empire of his own. Within a year of his ascension to power, he summoned all his banners to him, and he united all the lands from the Lake of Mists and Vales to the Castrovian Sea. He named this land Iobaria, and became its first king. In the early years of his rule, King Iobar established the great city of Credorn on the Castrovian Sea, determined to build a port on the other great shore of his kingdom that would rival his home of Orlov in the north. Unfortunately, growth of the city was stymied by Yenshaburi pirates from across the Castrovian Sea. In his later years, King Iobar increasingly spent time in Credorn himself to shore up the city's defenses, convinced that if he could make the city impregnable, then Iobaria itself would become the vital trade thoroughfare between the nations of Casmaran and Avistan, as no traders or merchants would brave the journey across the windswept wastes. It could be argued his determination would prove his undoing. In 937, Casman pirates once again besieged Credorn, seeing it as an opportunity to plunder the vast wealth King Iobar was funneling into the nascent port city. King Iobar himself died in battle, defending the city against pirate raiders during the final battle of Credorn. King Hrugil, Iobar's eldest son, succeeded his father for the throne of Iobaria and focused on completing his father's great work, repelling the pirate fleets from the east and spending the rest of his rule improving Iobaria's fleets, intent on eradicating the powerful mercenary pirates and corsair fleets, as well as paid privateers from both Yenshabur and Ninshabur, the two dominant powers on the southern reaches of the Castrovian Sea. By 975, King Hrugil fulfilled his father's vision, and Crydorn arose as a great port city out of the ashes of various sieges and battles. Iobaria entered an age of plenty, and by 1080 two more large towns were established in Iobaria, the cities of Hrohran and Vladimir. In 1080, the Iobarian kingdom experienced its first major setback, with the outbreak of the Tyr Plague, which ravaged the human settlements around the Finadar forest and the Norinor forest. Despite the first plague outbreak, this event was fairly localized and controlled, and the kingdom recovered quickly. Between 1240 and 1528, the Iobarians continued to build more cities and townships in the region. They claimed the Cyclops ruins of Mavradia and Zradiniris, and turned those two ruins into bustling human settlements. Further up the Mirfrus River, they waged a 24-year-long war with the Hoofwood Centaurs to claim the city of Vernirn, located at a vital fork where the Mirfrus met the Ardshod River. Finally, they established a second port city along the Castrovian Sea, called Mern Bay, a city that grew so rapidly it soon outstripped old King Iobar's much-loved port of Crydorn to be the wealthiest port city on the northern Castrovian. In 1634, there emerged a necromancer in central Iobaria named Otib the Undying. Plumbing secret knowledge from the Cyclops ruins, Otib developed the Chardeath, a magically engineered plague that would cause its victims to combust in flames as they died. The plague was both deadly and virulent, and at least a third of the major Iobarian settlements suffered major fires as a result of this unusual magical contagion. Despite human advancement in the region, Iobaria had always been a wild land, and in 1717 this fact was brought into shocking clarity for its residents when two ancient dragons, a blue and a red, named Shrodniar and Voldmanasine respectively, clashed over Fangard Forest. Both dragons died in the struggle, though the conditions that led to their deaths remain unclear. The great dragon Shrodnair crashed near the city of Antol, with strange glyphs discovered burnt into the blue dragon's body so deeply that they scarred even his bones. Voldmanasine instead crashed deep in the Fangard, with some claiming that a force from deep within the forest itself struck the ancient dragon dead after the battle was already over. In the year 1900, the centaur tribes of the Semarin Plains united under the banner of a seer named Erendane. They sacked the great port city of Mern Bay, and destroyed numerous other human settlements as well. The centaurs began to carve out a small kingdom for themselves in this period, but in 1986, Erendane the Seer died mysteriously after an unnaturally long life, and shortly thereafter the centaurs of the region abandoned their warlike ways, returning to the more peaceful nomadic lifestyle they had led prior to the old seer's arrival. From 2009 to 2014, the Taldans launched their fifth army of exploration, this one with its sights set northwards. They pushed beyond the swampy gnarl marches that served as a natural border between their conquered river kingdoms and the unclaimed lands west of Iobaria. Although the local populace of mixed Iobarian and Ulfin ethnicity did their best to unify and resist Taldan occupation, the Taldans deployed a magical siege engine called the Worldbreaker, which enabled them to knock down the walls of any forts and cities they encountered with relative ease. This pushed the borders of the Taldan Empire all the way to the Lake of Mists and Veils. Taldan occupation here differed slightly from its occupation in the River Kingdoms. In the River Kingdoms, the Taldans found the local Kelids were too unruly to govern, and quickly stamped them out wherever they could, effectively wiping out the local populations. But north of the Gnarl Marches, the Iobarians were more akin to the Varisians of Ustalav, and they more readily integrated with the Taldan rulers. In time, many provincial governors and rulers would be of mixed Iobarian, Ulfin, and Taldan ancestry, and an emergent class of mixed nobility would begin to establish itself in the region that would create some long-lasting dynasties, many of which would outlast the Taldan occupation of the region. In any case, the Taldans established two main provinces in the region, the province of Issia in the north and the province of Rossland in the south. Although in the early years of Taldan occupation, a Taldan provincial governor was instated in the province of Issia at the newly established provincial capital of Port Ice, it was not long before the wealthy and cunning Iobarian noble house of Sertova swore fealty to the Taldans and were able to secure provincial governorship. Though required to pay Taldan taxes, House Sertova would have uncontested rule in Issia for more than 1,000 years. Interestingly, although the Sertovans claimed distant lineage to King Iobar himself through some convoluted means, their wealth and power didn't come from their lineage, but from their profession, as skilled pirates and smugglers, and prior to their skillful diplomacy with the Taldans, the Surtovans had plied their shady business across the Lake of Mists and Veils and all along the lengths of the Selen River. Meanwhile, in the south, the Taldans established the provincial capital in the growing city of New Stetven, but it exchanged hands several times between several different Taldan governors, typically stern men with a long military history, but each in turn failed to truly bring the unruly outlying territory under anything approaching any kind of order, at least until 3035, but we'll get to that later. Despite having been sacked and taken by centaurs only 30 years ago, humans had begun to flood back to the city of Mernbay after the centaurs abandoned it, and by 2108 it had re-emerged as a regional power once again. Its defenses were reinforced, and the new government passed a rule that would ban centaurs from entering the city for more than 400 years. In 2546, another major plague, this one dubbed Ojar's Plague, ravaged the kingdom of Iobaria, the third such major plague outbreak in the last 1500 years. Still, the nation managed to recover and persevere. In 2602, Iobaria suffered its first major civil conflict. In the eastern reaches, a combined kingdom of humans and centaurs would form the new kingdom of Zastel, with its capital situated in Mavradia. Between 2654 and 2686, the Iobarians would launch the Reclamation War, which eventually they would win, effectively reuniting the kingdom. Between 2742 and 2920, Iobaria experienced not just one calamity, but many, all in rapid succession. For 6 years, a terrible plague called the Choking Death swept through the land in this period. This respiratory disease suffocated more than 40% of Iobaria's adult population, as it was more virulent than any of the previous plagues to have come through the land. The Choking Death even spread through Taldor's northern provinces, as refugees brought it with them. The Choking Death was then followed by the Plague Strife, a series of riots and sectarian violence that occurred as a direct result of anger and loss due to the Choking Death. In the Plague Strife, various druid sects, guilds, and political groups accused each other of bringing the disease, failing to control it, or otherwise being responsible. Skirmishes and vendettas would erode Iobaria's central government control of its various cities and factions. Finally, in 2920, the Central Chasman earthquakes, which would also affect Taldor and Kadira in the south, caused massive flooding all over the coastal settlements along the northwestern Castrovan, leaving many cities damaged or destroyed by the tidal waves. Not surprisingly, by the early 3000s, Iobaria experienced a period they called the Great Exodus. Iobarians left Iobaria in huge numbers. Many settled in the northern provinces of Taldor, in the lands that would become Brevoy, and the river kingdoms. However, some chose to sail east across the Lake of Mists and Veils, and settled in the unclaimed lands east of Sarkoris. These Iobarians arrived in fairly large numbers, and established a few notable settlements in the region, the first being the port city of Agede. These settlers quickly realized that there was money to be made by passing the Taldan territories and trading directly with the nation of Ustalav, which could be reached by following the Egelsee River from Agede to Karkau, the provincial capital of the Ustalavic province of Sinaria. The Ustalavs were happy to acquire Iobarian goods without paying the high tariffs charged by the Taldan imperialists. As a result, these settlers would establish further settlements all along the Egelsee River. Because the wild Estrovian forest abutted with the Egelsee River, many of these smaller towns, like Lackthroat and Elunas, were built on the Numerian side of the river, which of course meant that they were subject to near constant raiding by Kelid marauders, and in time these wild frontier settlements would become mixed Iobarian and Kelid frontier towns. Finally, the Iobarian settlers would build a much larger and more secure city further upriver at the conjunction of the Egelsee and West Selen, a city called Nerosian. In time, Nerosian would become the capital of a new Iobarian principality named Mendev. The Mendevians would establish another moderately sized township further up the West Selen as well, the town of Kenabres. Humans weren't the only to flee Iobaria. Iobaria at the time was also the home to the Merini halflings, a halfling people that had adapted to the region's colder climates. They suffered so greatly from the choking plague that they scattered all over the remote parts of eastern Avistan, becoming itinerant travelers, never resting in one place for too long. I discussed the Merini halflings in more detail in my Smallfolk Ancestry Guide video. In 3035, in the province of Rossland, provincial governorship came to a hot-headed, impulsive noble forced to the outer reaches of the empire from central Taldor after losing one too many duels. His name was Baron Syrian Aldori, or as he preferred it, the Sword Baron. After the provincial capital of New Stetven suffered a number of brutal attacks from bandit lords to the south, Baron Aldori accepted a challenge from the ruling bandit lord at the end of the year, to a duel for the future of the province. However, the Sword Baron was unable to best the bandit king, and he honored his word, handing the provincial governorship over to the bandit, paying his dues, and disappearing. Most assumed he was gone for good, too embarrassed to show his face after his defeat. However, 9 years later he returned to New Stetven. In 3044, Baron Aldori returned a changed man, older, wiser, and more skilled. Aldori challenged the new governor to a rematch. The bandit king haughtily agreed, but Aldori defeated him handily, in seconds. He followed this with a standing offer of 100,000 gold pieces as a reward for any who could best him in a battle of blades. None could defeat him, whether through legitimate means or trickery or magic. Not only was Aldori extremely skilled, but he used a technique and a sword that none were familiar with. At first, Aldori refused to teach any of his techniques, but he eventually capitulated and began to train a select group of swordsmen under certain stipulations. These conditions ensured that each student swore to change their name to Aldori, never teach their techniques to any outside the Aldori Sword Pact, and were sworn to uphold a secret pact of honor. These swordsmen became known as the Aldori Sword Lords, and they would rule Rossland for generations, each as prickly and impulsive as the Order's founder. Meanwhile, back in Iobaria in 3150, the final nail in the coffin of the Kingdom of Iobaria was yet another plague. The pestilentropy infected many nomads and settlers in central Iobaria, causing fevers and madness, ultimately leading to death by overexertion or by the blades of those its victims imagined to be their foes. The disease or its manic side effects destroyed more than half of Iobaria's farms, villages, crops, and cattle, leading to a decade of lean harvests and starvation for the region. This devastation and the lack of support for the people led to the final dissolution of the Iobarian rule. The last king died, and there was no successor. After the pestilentropy, it took half a century before anyone had the confidence or the will to attempt to reunite the land. When it did finally occur in 3212, it was not one individual, as it had been before. 3 separate warlords, including one hailing from the occupied Taldan province of Isia, and their allies banded together to restore the nation of Iobaria. It was no small feat. Local warlords and bandit kings had secured a good deal of power over the last 60 years, however, and the Restoration War lasted for nearly a century before Iobaria officially re-emerged as a polity. At the end of the Restoration War, there was a short but vicious power struggle between the various factions that had united their forces to unify the land. And the ultimate winner of that was Prince Iral of House Arjal, whose house would become the ruling dynasty of the new Iobaria for hundreds of years. Iral's ultimate ascension was secured in 3283 when he betrayed his longtime ally, House Narkis, in order to secure an allegiance with a number of red and white dragons that dwelt in the Cirzemian mountains. By offering the dragons a living sacrifice in the form of House Narkis' leaders and soldiers, the dragons would become the enforcers of House Arjal's rule. Later, Prince Iral would also enter into a feud with its other former ally, House Coria, which resulted in House Coria and its allies fleeing west into Brevoy, where some of their descendants can still be found. In 3304, Prince Iral was crowned King Iral I of House Arjal and moved the capital of Iobaria from Orlov to Antol. That year, he also turned control and domain of all the old Cyclops ruins to their white and red dragon allies, the final terms of his allegiance with them. Between 3679 and 4001, the War of the Great Horde occurred. Despite King Iral and House Arjal's alliance with the Cirzemian dragons, the forces of House Arjal were put to the test when an alliance of giants set their sights on Iobaria. A great Cyclops king named Burlor, possessed of 2 powerful artifacts that augmented his already great strength and charisma, the Maul of Perabov and the Crown of Mirim, assembled a vast army of Cyclops, ogres, and hill giants. Although the Great Horde was fought to a standstill outside the city of Orlov in the middle period of the war, the giant forces were bolstered by frost giant forces from the ice steppes that emerged from the blizzards of the north during a long and especially harsh winter. Although House Arjal managed to ultimately fend off the giant onslaught, this costly war both drained it of its resources and ultimately broke its alliance with the Cirzemian dragons, who also suffered greatly during the war. In the long run, this would begin to break House Arjal's hold on power in the region. In 4081, the Taldan Empire collapsed. The western half of the empire, Imperial Cheliax, would emerge as the dominant power in southwestern Avistan. In the northeast, however, the river kingdoms would become independent nation-states in their own right. Similarly, the Taldan provinces of Rossland and Issia became independent countries, ruled by the Surtova and the Aldori families respectively. With the disappearance of Taldan oversight in the region, the natural animosity between the houses of Surtova and Aldori grew hot. Over the next 400 years, Rossland and Issia would intermittently go to war with each other, swapping lands along their hotly contested border. However, as we'll see, the conflict between these two nations would never properly come to a head, but to understand why, we have to look east again. In Iobaria, as stated earlier, as a result of the damage wrought by the War of the Great Horde, the ruling House Arjal, which held the United Kingdom together, was weakening its grip on the land. Stretched thin and running out of resources, numerous emerging powers were starting to threaten House Arjal for dominion. One of these individuals was a charismatic, fair-haired man from Kyria named Korl of House Regarvia, whose influences were spreading throughout the region. Like House Arjal of old, Korl managed to secure an alliance with a number of the Red Dragons that dwelt in the Cirzemian Mountains, where Kyria is located. As House Arjal began to assemble its own forces and allies to confront the upstart warlord, Korl Regarvia himself thought better of engaging with House Arjal for power in Iobaria. Instead, he turned his attention west. He marched his army across the delta beneath the Soreth Wood and rounded the Ice Rime Peaks and entered into Brevoy. In 4499, his army was camped at the north edge of the Ice Rime Peaks on the banks of the Lake of Mists and Veils, and he sent a summons to Lord Nikos Surtova, the High Lord of Issia. Seeing the great size of the army Korl Regarvia had assembled, not to mention the dragons that accompanied them, made the wily Lord Nikos realize he would have to find terms. The two men staked out a truce that was bound with a promise of Nikos' daughter, Mirna Surtova, in marriage to Korl. In the agreement, Issia's ruling house Surtova kept much of its power and wealth, while they would serve as vassals under Korl's leadership. Korl Regarvia then attempted to do the same thing with the Aldori swordlords of southern Rossland. However, the swordlords did not agree to peace with Korl, and were defeated by a pair of Korl's Red Dragon allies at the Valley of Fire. After this, only the fortress of Skywatch continued to resist Korl's dominance, but even this bastion of the Aldori fell a few years later when Korl and his dragons arrived and burnt the castle to the ground. With his victory complete, Korl showed interest in the observatory and ordered the structure be unearthed and restored. By 4503, Korl had united all the lands of these two nations under his banner as the new nation of Brevoy, and placed the capital of the country in the old Rossland capital of New Stetven. It is said that Korl the Conqueror spent most of the time he had ruling from the Dragonscale throne at the Ruby Fortress in New Stetven amassing wealth, and only leaving New Stetven to harshly punish disloyal vassals. His people rarely saw him, and viewed him as a remote and terrifying figure. However, abruptly in 4509, Korl and his Red Dragon allies disappeared, leaving his descendants, the young princes of House Regarvia, to rule Brevoy. It is not known where Korl went when he abandoned his throne, but rumors suggested that he disappeared into the depths of the Gronzi forest, and that he swore he would return when the time was right. Even though this was 200 years ago, recent discoveries suggest that Korl himself may actually still be alive. The reason for this is that in recent years, a box made from authentic Red Dragon scales and sealed with the crest of House Regarvia was recently discovered in the Lake of Mists and Veils by the half-elven archivist Nephira. Inside it were numerous papers documenting dragon sightings and attacks, all of which match times when Korl was known to have been present in Brevoy, and the royal Red Dragons were known to have been absent. These letters provided some evidence that Korl was not human, as the historical records claimed, but was himself a red dragon. If that's the case, 200 years is well within a dragon's lifespan, and Korl may well return someday. On the other hand, it's clear from the historical record that Korl the Conqueror himself had grown quickly bored with the duties of rulership when he had it, and that might well explain his abrupt departure, though no one knows for sure. Speaking of dragons, in 4519, not long after Korl abdicated the throne of Brevoy, another strange affliction struck the land. But this time it only affected dragons. The Drake Plague, as it was called, proceeded to kill more than half of the dragon population within 3 months. Before the end of that year, the silver dragon Cithethriane, supported by druids from the Finadar forest, were able to perform a ritual to end the plague before it spread beyond Iobaria, but they did so at the cost of that dragon's life. In 4606, Golarion experienced the series of events known as the Death of Prophecy, including the death of the god Aradin, and more significantly in this part of the world, the opening of the Worldwoun in Sarkoris. Sarkorian barbarians were forced to flee the expanding Worldwoun, and a number of Kelid tribes entered Brevoy en masse, while many others, desperate to get even further away, crossed the polar ice to Iobaria. In 4607, Sarkorian Kelids, not finding a ready welcome in Iobaria, banded together and conquered the city of Mavradia. This would be the first of many dominoes to fall, leading to mass infighting across the entire country. In 4622, the Church of Aradin, reeling from the death of its patron, sought for an effort to convert the remaining followers of the fallen god into a righteous path that might unify them. Their plan, to initiate a great crusade against the demons spilling forth from the Worldwoun, an event they blamed for and associated with the death of their god. With the support of the Church of Iobaria, thousands of crusaders flooded into Mendev. The First Crusade would last for 8 years, from 4622 to 4630, and so many disillusioned Aradinites and newly converted Iobarians came into the nation of Mendev that it effectively resulted in the transformation of Mendev into a militant crusader state. The crusade was successful at first, but the demons eventually began striking back. The Crusaders reinforced and fortified the Mendevian capital city of Nerosian and the city of Kenabres. They also established the fortress of Dresden in the northern reaches of the Worldwoun, but in 4638 Dresden fell to demonic forces. The loss of Dresden led to the launch of the Second Mendevian Crusade, which lasted from 4638 to 4645. In this crusade, magical barriers called wardstones were built along the southern and eastern borders of the Worldwoun to contain the demons' advancement and influence. In 4659, the last king of House Arjal was assassinated. The former capital of Antol was conquered by a bandit king from the nearby city of Vecca, with no ties to the old nobility. The former aristocracy of Iobaria was reduced to the now isolated cities of Crydorn, Mernbay, and Orlov, each of whose rulers held equal claim to be true ruler and heir of Iobaria due to blood ties to the dead kings, though perhaps none so cleanly as House Rukov of Mernbay, whose lineage descended directly from House Arjal. Unfortunately for House Rukov, their own hold on the city of Mernbay was complicated, as they led an alliance of noble houses there and had only tenuous direct control on the city, and they were never able to get into a position with enough leverage to make a claim on the entire country. Meanwhile, in Mendev, the Third Mendevian Crusade kicked off in 4665. But this time the demons changed tactics, using infiltration, subversion, and corruption to undermine their opponents. The Crusaders suffered many defeats, and witch hunts against suspected demonic cultists and other traitors became commonplace. To make up for the shortfall in men, new recruits were drawn from among convicted prisoners rather than from among those with righteous belief. As enthusiasm waned, the Third Mendevian Crusade petered out a mere 3 years after it had begun. In 4667, just south of the River Kingdoms, in a nation not represented in this close-up map, the Red Revolution occurred in Galt. The Galtish nobility were forced to gather their wealth and go into hiding. As discussed in my River Kingdoms video, many Galtish nobles made their way there, especially in the specific kingdoms of Gralton and Liberthane. But many Galtish nobles also found the River Kingdoms too rough for their taste. After all, the Sixth River freedom, you have what you hold, more or less codified robbery into law. Essentially, any noble Galtish person that could not protect his own wealth was liable to be robbed. Most therefore moved on, typically further north. In Brevoy, the Galtish nobility found a land slightly more to their liking, but here the ruling house Regarvia had a total stranglehold on power, and their draconian laws didn't permit the formation of new, wealthy noble or merchant-class families to set up shop in the kingdom, restricting power to the 7 major houses that dwelled in that land since before even the coming of the Taldans. It wasn't really until the exiled Galtish nobility reached Iobaria, the land whose central monarchy had melted down as a result of war and disease, that they found a place where they could thrive and put their wealth to good use. The vast majority of these Galtish nobles eventually made their way to the port city of Mernbay, the largest city in the region. Mernbay already had 17 noble houses jockeying for power, without a clear leader among them, save perhaps for the much diminished House Rukov, who could trace their lineage back to House Arjal. In the 6 years since the Galtish began to emigrate here, the migration has been so significant that the city now counts 22 great houses, with 5 of them being the houses of fabulously wealthy Galtan lords who have already managed to rebuild much of their fortune and influence here. In 4692, a new demon leader, Khorramzadeh the Storm King, emerged in the Worldwoun and did significant damage to the Kenabris Wardstone. This event triggered the Fourth Crusade, the longest and most exhausting of the Crusades. When it finally ended, it was due to dwindling resources and fatigue on the part of the Crusaders. In early 4699, a strange event known as the Vanishing occurred in the nation of Brevoy. This event saw King Ertzin Regarvia disappear. In fact, every member of the ruling house Regarvia vanished without a trace, leaving the country to be fought over by other feuding noble houses. House Regarvia had previously ruled the unified nation of Brevoy for 200 years from the Dragonscale throne, but in their absence, House Sertova took over as the ruling dynasty. King Noleski Sertova currently reigns from the Ruby Fortress in Ustetven. Despite over a decade passing, no explanation for the fate of House Regarvia has ever been discovered. Finally, in 4718, the Fifth Mendevian Crusade kicked off in a series of events played out in the Wrath of the Righteous adventure path. The crusade is sparked by a demonic assault on Kenabris, after which a small band of heroes enter the Worldwoun, slay the demon lord Descari, and seal it. Following the closure of the Worldwoun in 4718, Queen Galfrey of Mendev led the assault on the now trapped demons and brought a glorious end to the Fifth Mendevian Crusade. Following this, Galfrey stepped down as Mendev's leader and named Crusader Knight Irahai, now Chancellor Irahai, as her successor, and asked her not to hold the seat in permanence, but to oversee a transition to a civilian Mendevian government. Then Queen Galfrey departed the mortal world altogether, ascended to the heavens, and has moved on to become the goddess Iomede's new herald. This brings us to today. Today, the 3 major Iobarian city-states, Mendev, Brevoy, and Iobaria, all share some similarities. They have all undergone significant amounts of recent hardship, and are in a period of renewal. Mendev went from a backwater Iobarian colony to a crusader nation-state 100 years ago, when the Worldwound opened up. However, only 5 years ago now, heroes managed to seal the Worldwound. Now, the Crusaders, and the money the various churches that sponsored those crusades had brought with them, are leaving the country in droves to go and deal with other problems throughout the land. When Mendev stops being a crusader nation, what kind of nation does it become? Of all the nations in the region, their future is perhaps the most murky. Crusader Knight Irahai was originally a Thuvian national raised among the Iomedean clergy, who eventually became a logistics administrator for the Crusades. When the Worldwound was closed, Irahai was appointed by the Queen to oversee the transition to a civilian government. As Chancellor, one of Irahai's first acts had been to establish the Mendevian Delegation, a parliamentary body representing the interests of the people. Her current focus is on redistributing much of Mendev's wealth, which has long been held in trust by the Crusaders, to its rightful owners. However, this task is complicated by a lack of written records, intermarriage between Crusaders and the local people, as well as various instances of demonic corruption that disqualify certain claims to inheritance. There is also the matter of there being 2 different people effectively claiming right to the land, the Iobarian Mendevians and the Sarkorian Kelids, who possess radically different cultures and laws. Despite her good intentions, Irahai has encountered difficulties due to conflicting claims to the land. She has already misplaced trust in individuals, such as, for example, to the Sarkorian shaman Lokalat, who made false claims about his people's traditions on certain hunting grounds and ownership of some valuables which he claimed before disappearing. In the last year, Irahai has also accepted the help of the Magambaya Academy, represented by Envoy Genetimo, but she is more wary of trust right now. In addition, Irahai worries about the lack of basic infrastructure and national budget in Mendev, as most of its assets were built for military purposes, and many of the Crusaders who provided material support have departed. These issues keep her and the nation's citizens, regardless of whether they be Iobarian, Kelid, or other migrant ethnicities, awake at night. Brevoy has similarly undergone a very recent change of leadership. Brevoy was united by Karl the Conqueror, now presumed by many to have been a red dragon shapeshifted as a human warlord 200 years ago. However, 20 years ago, Urzan Regarvia, the last king of his house, was not found in his bedchambers that morning, nor could his wife and children be located. In the next few weeks, those governing in the capital of New Stetven would come to find that not even his various cousins, nieces, and nephews could be located. In a single day, the entire ruling family of Brevoy disappeared, and no one has any idea why it happened or where they went. This event is now being called the Vanishing, and not surprisingly, there was a succession crisis. There were 6 other noble families that could trace lineage back to Iobar the Great, the pre-Taldan king from which all noble Iobarians can trace descent. These great houses, sequenced geographically, are House Sertova, whose ancestral seat of power is Port Ice. House Sertova is known to have made their money through piracy and raiding along the banks of the Great Lake and along the lengths of the Selen River. Even today, one of the more active pirates of the Lake of Mists and Veils, Captain Vali Dobos, is rumored to have a close connection with the Sertovas, although he keeps his lineage hidden. The head of the house is Noleski Sertova. Their heraldic crest is a grey ship, in front of fields of blue on the lower half, and black with silver stars on the upper half. Their house words are, "Ours is the right." Moving east, House Lodovka is a noble family of Brevoy with their headquarters on Acuban Isle on the Lake of Mists and Veils, where they hold the impressive city of Winterbreak. They have traditionally been a significant power on the lake. Led by Lord Kozek Lodovka, both their fleet size and influence along the lake have continued to increase. The family's primary industry is seafood, and they catch fish, freshwater crabs, and lamprey eels, which are delicacies across the region. The house's crest includes a green crab climbing out of the water towards a grey tower or keep. Their motto is, "The waters, our fields." House Garrus is based on the western part of Brevoy, commanding the area surrounding the Golishkin Mountains, from their dwarven-engineered holdfast of Greyhaven. House Garrus has long held a special relationship with the Golka dwarves, who lived both deep in the mountains and in the dwarven surface hold of Hydelve. They've held this special relationship since before the coming of the Taldans, and so their lands have always remained secure. It is currently led by Lord Howland Garrus, who has been robbed of much in recent years. He is a widower now, as his wife succumbed to an unknown malady. His only son, who Howland had spent much effort to arrange a marriage for with the lesser members of the previous ruling House Regarvia, disappeared in the Vanishing, along with his fiancée. Finally, in conjunction with the Vanishing, the tunnels leading to the underground Golka holdings mysteriously collapsed, sealing in the High King of the Golka dwarves. No magical means to clear the collapse, or means of divination or communication with the buried dwarves have revealed what has happened to them. One might expect Howland to succumb to bereavement under such difficult circumstances, but he has remained strong. Additionally, the Dwarf King's youngest son survived the Golka collapse, as he had been living among the surface dwarves of Hydelve, and so Lord Howland has made the unusual choice of adopting the Dwarf Prince as his ward. Lord Howland believes Prince Tolva Golkin will need mentoring and rule that his late father will no longer be able to provide. Lord Howland and Prince Tolva are now trying to uncover what happened to the underground dwarf holds, while also anticipating the political movements of the other great human houses of Brevoy. House Garrus's crest is that of a snow-capped mountain peak in grey set against a dark blue field. There is a silvery crescent moon in the upper right corner, and there is a black hammer across the base of the peak. The house's motto is, "Strong as the Mountains." East again, House Orlovsky controls northeastern Brevoy from Eagle's Watch on Mount Veshka. Though they try to rise above the squabbling of other houses, they were also staunch allies of the now-disappeared House Regarvia, which has landed them in a prickly situation in the current climate. Lord Paul Orlovsky is head of House Orlovsky, though much of his diplomacy abroad is carried out by his niece, Lady Silvana Orlovsky, who is also the captain of House Orlovsky's forces. Their house crest is a black eagle with wings spread in front of a gold field, and their motto is, "High Above." House Lebeda controls the western half of what was once the United Kingdom of Rossland. They typify the former ruling powers of Rossland, having significant Taldan blood and an appreciation for fine things, especially wine and sword fighting. Their ancestral fortress, Silverhall, overlooks Lake Rakal and controls the shipping on the lake, and their business of being brokers and merchants linking the north and south of Brevoy has made them quite rich. House Lebeda has changed hands frequently over the last few years. When her husband passed, Dame Sirona Lebeda ruled as regent until her eldest son Lander came of age, after which Lord Lander Lebeda ruled in Silverhall, but as he is currently in exile, his older sister Ilana has now taken over rulership of the house. The Lebeda house crest is a swan sitting on water, with the sun in the horizon. Depending on how the house fares, the people say the sun is either rising or setting. House Medved holds sway over the eastern territories around the Gronzi forest. They adhere to an older druidic way of life they refer to as the Old Way, and they revere nature. Lord Gurev Medved rules the house from their castles in the foothills of the Ice-Rime peaks called Stoneclimb. The inhabitants of this region raise mountain goats and sheep, hunt in the forest, and cultivate the limited arable land on the outskirts of their domains. While Erastil is the primary religion in the area, there are also rumors of concealed shrines dedicated to Lamashtu. Their house emblem features a black bear with black antlers over its head against a red backdrop. Their motto is, "Endurance overcomes all." Finally, the eastern portion of the old kingdom of Rossland had been until recently controlled by House Regarvia, the descendants of Karl the Conqueror, whose heraldry featured a two-headed red dragon and whose house motto was "With sword and flame." However, since the disappearance of that entire house, the land has become part of a larger power struggle in the region. One more faction is worth noting, however. As I discussed in my River Kingdoms Deep Dive video, the House Aldori Swordlords and their allies fled south to the River Kingdoms when Karl conquered Rossland. In the River Kingdoms, House Aldori established the country of Mivan, and the current ruling swordlord of Mivan is a shrewd man named Raston Selene. His country is home to no fewer than 9 major Brevik houses who fled the country, and these 9 houses are known as the Houses in Exile, and each of them are now wondering if now is the time to make a return to their ancestral country, since the politics have gotten so shaken up. I should also note that there are a small handful of houses in exile located in Mendev as well, though these have shown less interest in returning to either Brevoy or Iobaria than the Mivanese have. Let's take a more detailed look at the last couple of years here to catch up on local politics. First, shortly after the disappearance, there was a mad scramble for power. The winner of this power struggle wasn't the wealthiest of the noble houses, which is currently House Lebeda, followed closely by House Geres, despite its setbacks due to the collapse of their mining tunnels, nor was it the house with the greatest army, which is arguably the vast fleet of House Ludovka or the extensive cavalry of House Orlovsky. Rather, it was the cleverest and most politically minded of the houses, House Surtova. It occurred something like this. Lord Noleski, the head of House Surtova, had been a bachelor for many years, despite pressure to marry and produce an heir for the house. In the wake of the vanishing, Lord Noleski and his clever sister Natala Surtova saw an opportunity to preempt the war. They offered a prospective alliance between House Surtova and House Lebeda that would have symbolically united North and South and brought much-needed stability to fractured Brevoy. Lord Noleski Surtova would be crowned king, and Ilana Lebeda would be his queen. In this way, both northern and southern halves of the country would share some of the power. Although the Surtova family would hold the greater power on account of the patriarchal structure of the Brevik monarchy, the Lebeda family would also be able to slowly reclaim some of the southern holdings that had been in the possession of House Regarvia. This seemed like a fair compromise, and it was with tactics like this that the less wealthy and less well-provisioned House Surtova was able to acquire the monarchy. Lord Noleski was crowned in 4700 as the new king of Brevoy, or more completely, the High Lord of Issia and Rossland, suzerain of Neustetven, overlord of Restov, defender of the Lake of Mists and Vale, regent of the Dragonscale throne, blood of the Conqueror, and rightful king of the United Kingdom of Brevoy. However, the wedding of King Noleski of House Surtova and Lady Ilana of House Lebeda dragged on for years and years, with various reasons being cited for the delay of the nuptials, such as having to secure the borders or deal with bandit raiders to make sure the king's position was on a secure footing before the kingdom would welcome the wedding, with each of these delaying tactics being able to be reasonably tied back to the machinations of Lady Natala Surtova. Finally, the date was set for the spring of 4718, now just 5 years ago, but the wedding once again never came to pass. Natala Surtova gave a public speech days before the wedding, formally accusing Lord Lander Lebeda of treason. Lord Lander only escaped public execution by disappearing. Because of the scandal, the wedding never happened, and Lady Ilana returned home in humiliation. By this time, of course, the Surtova had secured much of their power, and most of the Brevic nobility believed, or claimed to believe, the Surtovan accusations. The notable exception were members of House Orlovsky, who claimed that the facts supporting the purported treason were contradictory and unclear, and countered that this was most likely Surtovan propaganda. This has caused a significant fracture between the houses of Surtova and Orlovsky, one that threatens to escalate into armed confrontation, especially should the Surtovans move publicly against the Lebadan holdings in Rossland. Since this event, Ilana has been running the interests of House Lebeda from Silverhall, particularly shoring up her defences, waiting for the day the Surtovans deploy forces against her. As for Lord Lander, no one is quite sure what happened to him, but rumours persist that he travelled south to Mivan to gather an army for himself so that he might return and retake Rossland, and potentially even end the rule of the traitor king. In the capital, King Noleski remains a bachelor, and rumours abound here as well, with some calling his sister Natala the puppeteer queen and the real power behind the throne. As King Noleski is getting older with each passing year, some worry that he'll never have any heirs, and if he dies without one, the country may soon descend into a succession crisis all over again. Now, at the top of this video, I mentioned that the Iobarians seem to me to be influenced by the Kievan Rus people of the real world, having been descended from a mix of Nordic and Eastern Avistinian people, but it should also be very obvious by now that there is another pretty significant influence at play here. I'm of course referring to Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. To briefly recap, Brevoy was a country conquered by an army whose power came from their dragons, but the previous regime has disappeared, and now the wiliest and most ruthless of the families have managed to secure a tenuous control of the throne. The links are obvious. If you enjoyed the books or the show, this could be a fun place to set a game in and let your players enjoy that kind of tone. Finally, let's discuss Iobaria, Brevoy's even messier older brother. Iobaria is the original nation from which many of the citizens of both Brevoy and Mendev hail from, but they've been harried by plague and war for so long that their country's original power structure has almost completely dissolved. As of about 65 years ago, there has no longer been a ruling monarch in the country. Now 3 cities have effectively become independent city-states, and these are Krydorn, Mernbay, and Orlov, each of whose rulers hold equal claim to be the true ruler and heir of Iobaria due to their respective blood ties to dead kings. If Brevoy is a powder keg ready to erupt, then Iobaria is one that has already erupted, with each of its myriad noble houses desperately trying to position themselves to hold power in the aftermath of that ruin. The most significant of these houses include House Koria of Orlov, House Evies of Krydorn, and the houses Rukov and Zagi of Mernbay. But the noble houses are not the only ones vying for power here. Various self-made bandit kings are, like King Ryul of Vecchia, as well as non-human powers, including the various centaur tribes that dominate the country's interior, as well as the giant survivors of the Cyclops King Burlor's great horde. Should the giants ever unify again, there is no united force to protect the country this time. Finally, despite the Drake Plague, in the Sirzemian Mountains and other places, powerful chromatic dragons still roost, which at various times have been closely invested in the power dynamics of the human nations that formed around their rugged domains. Let's not forget the recent discoveries made around the nature of Karl the Conqueror himself, that he might be a red dragon, and still alive, and no one knows what his ultimate ambitions may be. All 3 of these nations are on the precipice of great change, their futures uncertain, but there will be great struggles ahead, a perfect time for heroes of renown to appear and shape their destinies. Important locations in Mendev. The Ice Rift Castle. During the First Mendevian Crusade, the government of Mendev decided to establish a stronghold on its northern border with the Worldwoun. As a result, work began on building Ice Rift Castle at the source of the West Selen River near the Crown of the World. Before the castle was finished, however, a party of soldiers was sent north to help escort home some of the construction crew and their guards, only to find that they had all been slaughtered and their hearts removed. Today it is rumored that a tribe of Wickawax, a race of Arctic bugbears, has occupied Ice Rift Castle. Led by their shaman Ugmitok, the new lords of the castle worship an ancient Wendigo that might have been the entity that caused the death of its original inhabitants nearly a century ago. Kenabres. Kenabres is a large fortified city, the 3rd largest in Mendev, and effectively the furthest and most populated outpost of the Crusaders, situated on the border of the Worldwoun. It has gained notoriety, not only as a vanguard for the war, but also, following the demonic insurgent tactics of the Third Crusade, as the hub of a radical faction of Iomadeans led by an elderly zealot named Hulrun Shapok, whose notorious witch hunts aimed at identifying any demonic influence in the populace have had significant collateral damage. Kennebres was also the site of the attack that triggered the fifth and final Mendevian crusade, and the city was so shattered by this attack that it is still very much recovering. Since the victory in the Worldwoun, the newly formed Order of the Heralds has made significant progress in cleaning up the city and in curbing the worst impulses of Hulrun's faction of inquisitors. Many people hope that these will completely disappear now that the Worldwoun is closed and that Hulrun himself has passed away. Kennebres is a city constructed across multiple tiers that gradually ascend from the eastern plains. Its western edge borders a cliff overlooking the West Selen River, which serves as the primary water source for the city. Over time, the population increase transformed the town into a city with 4 distinct districts. Old Kennebres, the original town, is home to the city's oldest lineages and administrative buildings. The Ring District, which surrounds Old Kennebres, is the second tier of the city, and was also part of the original town. New Kennebres was established as a safe haven for refugees from lost settlements after the opening of the Worldwoun. The Gate District was constructed a decade later due to the population growth of New Kennebres, and is now the largest district in the city. Although Truestone Quarry lies about 10 miles to the east of the city, it was historically vital to Kennebres' survival. The quarry sent caravans weekly to Southgate to supply stone for reinforcing the city's defenses. Daunton. Daunton is a small rural village just east of Kennebres. Mayor Tobias Lewin, a thick-chested halfling with white-braided hair, is the governor and sheriff of Daunton. During his 2 years of service in the Crusades, he lost his family to raids and his friends on missions. Emotionally and physically exhausted, he returned to Daunton to live out his life as a farmer, but the villagers recognized him as a hero and soon elected him mayor and sheriff. Daunton is also the site of the Pathfinder Society adventure Scars of the Third Crusade. Nerosian. Nerosian is the capital city of Mendev, and it sits at the convergence of the West Selen and Egglesey River. The city's western and southern walls are hugged by these rivers, while the land gradually rises towards the northeast before dropping off again just past the northeastern wall. Nerosian is known as the Diamond of the North, due to its 20-foot thick straight-edged walls that form a diamond shape. The city has well-planned avenues and interior walls that support the outer walls in case of an attack. The cruciform cathedral is located at the center of the city, and the inner walls divide the city into 4 easily defendable districts that are wide enough for knights to ride across. Chancellor Irahai currently rules all of Mendev from the cruciform, but has more direct control over Nerosian and its surrounding areas. Now that the Crusades have ended, her attention is towards an orderly transition from a military state to a civilian state, trying to unwind the complicated claims of ownership on the land from before the beginning of the Crusades. She has left many of the day-to-day matters of civic governance to her council, which is divided into 2 factions, one led by Lord Inquisitor Kasori, and the other led by Captain Jaspar of the Crusader Heralds. Lord Kasori wants to maintain Iomadean orthodoxy in Mendev and to keep it a pure state, while Captain Jaspar wants to just make sure the values and interests of Mendev's native peoples are respected. For over 100 years, Nerosian's primary focus has been war, and as such, it has depended on supplies and material in the same way most cities rely on trade. The city has little support from its hinterlands due to the threat of abyssal incursions, but it makes up for this with regular shipments coming from countries far and wide. Any shortages in these supplies were filled by profiteers eager to make money from a city that relied so heavily on its long supply lines. The fresh water for the capital city of Nerosian is sourced from the river Egglesey, and the abundant fisheries along the river provide food for its population. However, the most crucial aspect of the river is the unique mineral called Nexavar that collects in its silt. This mineral acts as a countermeasure against the corrupting influence of the Worldwoun. As a result, the southern part of the Selen River remains uncorrupted, and no aquatic demons can swim down its lengths to reach the neighboring lands or the inner sea. Without the presence of the Egglesey River, it's hard to imagine how far the demonic taint could have spread. Nexavar is so effective at halting corruption that it was used in constructing the wardstones that help contain the expanding Worldwoun. Nerosian is divided into 4 districts, each with 3 or 4 smaller neighborhoods. The Battle District in the northeast was entirely constructed during the First Crusade. It includes Battle Row, Crusader Row, and Low Row. The Egglesey district in the southeast includes Egglesey, Pilgrim's Rest, and Rustwell. The Confluence district in the southwest is the oldest district and includes the Windings, the Two Seas, Coopertown, and Riverside. The Woundward district in the northwest includes the districts of Bitterwind, Highside, Tumbletown, and Bannerbright. There are several important sites in Nerosian as well. The Battle Tower is the northernmost point and the most heavily fortified site in Mendev. The Cruciform Cathedral is both a site of worship and an integral part of the city's defensive systems. The Egglesey Tower serves as a rapid response staging area for Nerosian's cavalry. The Selland Docks are stone quays carved into the bedrock along the riverside. Starrise Spire acts as a beacon of hope and a final warning to any demons foolish enough to attack the city. Finally, the Woundward Tower bristles with spyglasses that scan the skies, as well as containing the most advanced siege engines and the best archers in Nerosian. The city's own wardstone is also housed in this tower as close to the border as possible. Alunus and Lackthroat. The walled towns of Alunus and Lackthroat are stopping points along the Egglesey River, and although technically in northern Numeria, because the opposite banks are too densely forested to build structures, they hold fealty to Nerosian and the Mendevians. These townships have been attractive targets for Numerian Kelid raiders since they were first established, and this has bred a hard and calloused populace. Known today as havens for ne'er-do-wells and mercenaries, the citizens of these towns take pride in their independence, and have also become known for being a people comfortable indulging in their own vices, perhaps a strange sense of earned privilege by being a part of the critical supply chain in the Crusader nation. Lackthroat is also reputed for being visited by the strange beings known as the Herne of the Estroven Forest. The Herne appear to be humans except for the stag horns growing from their forehead, and it is unknown whether they are haunting spirits or mischievous fae. One thing we do know, though, is that the Herne fiercely protect the Estroven Forest. Timal. Timal, the Pillar City, was an ancient Kelid settlement in the Estroven Forest, constructed with the help of the elves prior to Earthfall. It still contains the ancient and functioning Eidolon Gate, which connects the site to the elven kingdom of Keonin, and therefore many other elven power centers. However, the elves have not made use of this gate in generations, as the site of Timal is now controlled by a civilization of sphinx-like creatures called the Maftets, who have sworn fealty to the city's master, a powerful avatar of the old Sarkorian god called Igrir Skymane. For now, even the descendants of the Sarkorian Kelids who once worshipped Igrir are no longer welcomed in the Maftet city. Agede. Agede is a port city situated on the Lake of Mists and Veils, and the second largest city in Mendev. As the logical entry point for those reaching Mendev by sea, it was the first stop for most crusaders during the Mendevian Crusades. Trade from neighboring nations, especially Brevoy and Iobaria, flows into Mendev through Agede. During the Crusades, the city served as a place of rest for exhausted soldiers, and also played a significant role in the war. However, some of the cultural hardness of the other river cities like Alunus and Lackthroat have started to seep into Agede as well, and there are concerns being raised by the city's large and influential Iomadean church about the city becoming a hub of debauchery and sin due to its growing industry, trade, and business. Agede was also the location of Aradin's victory over the demon lord Cholerus, whom he faced in this land about 100 years before his disappearance and the death of prophecy. So naturally, it has always been a city controlled by the very devout, even before the Crusades. After the Crusades, the many vast temples of Aradin were slowly converted over to worship of Iomade. The people of Agede celebrate the anniversary of Aradin's battle with Cholerus as the Drowning Day, for Aradin was said to have drowned the demon in the Lake of Mists and Veils. This event is typified by mock violent drownings, which many outsiders find disturbing. In addition to its influential Iomadean clergy, worship of Gorum became popular due to the constant state of war in Mendev during the Crusades and in more recent times. The worship of Nocticula, the Redeemer Queen, has also been on the rise as well. Important locations in Brevoy. Port Ice. Port Ice is the ancestral seat of power of House Sertova. Situated on the cold banks of the Great Lake, Port Ice is often overcome by ice and snow in the winter months and sits closed, only visited occasionally until the springs thaw. The summer months are spent frantically stockpiling supplies for the next winter. King Noleski's uncle, Domani Sertova, serves in the White Manor as Port Ice's current caretaker. Greyhaven and Hydelve. Greyhaven is the seat of power of House Gares, who control the land around the Golishkin Mountains. When House Gares first came to these lands during the great Iobarian exodus of the early 3000s, they built a close and friendly relationship with the Golka dwarves, who happily let them settle in the mountains and surrounding hills, as most of their settlements were deep underground. They even lent their skilled craftsmanship to reinforcing the walls of Greyhaven Keep, and let them settle in their only above-ground dwarven settlement in the region, the city of Highdelve. Greyhaven remains a mostly human settlement, while Highdelve has since become a mixed human and dwarven settlement. Since the Vanishing 20 years ago, the dwarf tunnels collapsed, and the fate of the majority of the Golka dwarves remains uncertain. The strange stone containing the collapse has proved impassable with both technology and magic. Now the Prince of the Golka dwarves resides in Greyhaven, where he serves as the ward of Lord Howland Gilles, and he and the other dwarves of Highdelve seek desperately to discover what happened to the rest of their kinsfolk. So does House Gilles, as much of their wealth was grown from dwarven mining in the mountains. Highdelve is also the setting of the standalone Pathfinder module adventure Heroes for Highdelve. Zmeika. Although seemingly in the domain of House Gilles, Zmeika is actually governed by Silvana Orlovsky. Silvana Orlovsky is the niece of Lord Paul Orlovsky, the ruling lord of House Orlovsky. She is the captain of her house's forces, and she often acts as her uncle's ambassador further afield. Silvana is a skilled horsewoman, and known for her ability at jousting. She rides her steed Silvermane, whom she cares for herself at the stables at Zmeika. Silvana has a deep mistrust of House Sertova, and like most nobles of her house, has long been a supporter of the now-disappeared House Regarvia. Indeed, she was engaged to a member of House Regarvia from birth, until the Vanishing intervened and overturned that plan. She has also known the noble Lander Lebeda as a friend since childhood, and may be one of the few people who truly knows where the exiled lord is lying low. Winterbreak. Winterbreak is the seat of power of House Ladovka, situated on the Akuban Isle, surrounded by the freezing fogs of the Lake of Mists and Vale. Winterbreak is a bleak keep that breeds hearty but dour seafaring warriors. House Ladovka has the largest fleet in Brevoy, and their corsairs are reckoned to be among the fiercest soldiers in the land. Eagle's Watch. Eagle's Watch is the seat of power of House Orlovsky. Built high upon the sides of Mount Veshka, it is presumed to be an impregnable keep. As the commanders of the vast hill lands between Zmeika and the Skywatch built into the Ice Rime Hills, House Orlovsky maintains a long tradition of breeding rugged horses and commands a powerful cavalry. Silverhall. Silverhall is the seat of power of House Lebeda, and is located on the Ozera River in Brevoy, just before the river empties into Lake Rikal. It is currently ruled by Lady Alana, as her older brother, Lord Lander Lebeda, was forced to flee the capital of New Stetven the night prior to the proposed wedding between Lady Alana and King Noleski Sertova to avoid execution at the hands of the Sertovans. He has remained in hiding ever since. Silverhall has become increasingly militarized after Ilana returned, and she has been fortifying herself within the city, fearing that any year now King Noleski might bring an army to bear to take the Lebedan capital by force. New Stetven. New Stetven, located on the southern bank of Lake Rikal, was made the capital of the new nation of Brevoy by the warlord Karl the Conqueror in 4499 after unifying the separate nations of Issia and Rossland under his rule, and has served as the seat of power in Brevoy ever since. Today, New Stetven is a bustling trade hub, exporting Brevoy's abundant supply of grain, fish, timber, and ore to other northern kingdoms such as Mendev and Iobaria, and down the East Selen River to the river kingdoms. The food from Rossland is crucial to sustain many of the northern realms, where farming is challenging due to constant bandit raids or invading demonic armies. In return, New Stetven's rough-and-tumble marketplaces offer exotic imports from all corners of Avistan and beyond, such as rare Numerian sky metals and ancient Osiriani relics. Although it can get quite warm in the summer months, for most of the year snow and slush transform the streets of New Stetven into muddy paths. As the city of wooden palaces, New Stetven has made extensive use of wood in constructing everything from houses to streets to forts. Due to the numerous wooden structures within its walls, the city has several volunteer fire brigades that protect its buildings, and citizens take great pride in joining these brigades. Only two notable stone structures exist in New Stetven: the Ruby Fortress, where the dragon-scale throne sits, and the Bulwark of Gorum, a temple to the Lord of Iron. Skywatch. Originally an outpost built by House Sertova around an observatory, Skywatch was taken by House Aldori during one of Issia's many conflicts with Rosslands in the early 4000s. After Karl the Conqueror united both nations, however, he defeated the Aldori loyalists and destroyed the fortress, excavating an ancient pre-human observatory in the process. Strangely, on the same day in 4699 that every member of House Regarvia disappeared, Skywatch sealed itself off from all outsiders, including supply caravans. Since that day, no message sent to Skywatch has received a response, and even powerful divination magic fails to penetrate the city's ancient walls, just as was the case for the holds of the Golka dwarves in the Golshkin Mountains. Nobody knows what has happened inside the great observatory at Skywatch ever since. Stoneclimb. Stoneclimb is a rugged fortress built into the natural cliff face along the eastern side of the Ice Rime Peaks. It lies just south of Skywatch, and it is in the north of the lands ruled by House Medved. It is also their capital and seat of power, from where House Medved live and rule. Brunderton. The mining town of Brunderton in eastern Rossland in Brevoy was settled by dwarves, likely from the Golshkin Mountains originally, before most of the human settlements came to the region, because of the surrounding area's abundance of gems and ore. They have been separated from the rest of the Golka dwarfs for so long, though, that they can be considered a distinct dwarven group in the region. The Brunderton dwarves are more prone to travel and adventure than most of their kindred, and so most dwarves throughout southern Brevoy and the northern river kingdoms have relatives from here, and gem and ore traders from Brunderton can often be found peddling their wares along the Sellen's many towns and tributaries. Restov. As Brevoy's southernmost city, and seated on the edges of the fertile river kingdom, the large city of Restov has both the most pleasant climate and the most arable land in the region. It is therefore not surprisingly one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the country. It is sometimes referred to as the Free City, and although Restov owes its allegiance to the Brevic crown, and its Lord Mayor Josef Selemius must bend the knee to the dragon-scale throne, the city is not beholden to any noble house. The Aldori lords who fled to Mivan were never replaced, and though 20 years ago the city had its fair share of lesser nobles from the ruling Regarvia dynasty who wished to keep tabs on the place, those too have disappeared. Today Restov serves as a sanctuary for those who long for the old Aldori swordlords' days, and the time before Karl the Conqueror's arrival. The city is a unique blend of refinement and roughness, as it fondly remembers its former lords. Restov is a thriving trading hub on the border with the river kingdoms, which supports a considerable number of wealthy and titled elites, as well as merchant princes, but its mayor is neither. The elites here frequent the Aldori dueling schools, alehouses, and engage in street corner challenges at dawn and dusk. The city's schools, salons, and taprooms are also hotspots for rebellious talk against King Naleski Sertova's reign, with many young people seeking a leader to rally them to their cause. Points of interest in Restov include the Citadel, which is home to the mayor and the city guard, the Grand Theatre, which produces the most lavish productions in northeastern Avistan, the Great Temple of Erastil, watched over by High Priest Evzanki Keeg, the preeminent priest of Erastil in the entire region, the Aldori Academy, where students may learn the ancient and much-admired Aldori style of dueling, and the Regarvia House, which, though still called by the vanished clan's name, is in fact the home of the Bank of Free Restov, the temple of Abadar's primary financial rival in Restov, and in the rest of Brevoy, in fact. Important locations in Iobaria: Orlov, Okormir, Franax, and Orlendas. Collectively, these four cities form one of the remaining major power centers in Iobaria. Orlov, one of the oldest cities of Iobaria and once the capital of the First Realm, now lies mostly in ruins. Whether its structures were built by Cyclops or humans millennia later, every corner of the city is crumbling. The population has dwindled to less than half of its former size, and the remaining inhabitants choose to ignore or wall off areas that are too damaged to repair or inhabit. Prince Tsakiv of House Korea is one of the last surviving members of his family line, which descended from one of the factions that restored Iobaria after its first collapse. He believes that his heritage makes him the rightful heir to power, even though he lacks the funds, allies, and determination to rebuild the country. Instead, he bides his time and works to attract wealthy supporters from Cheliax or the river kingdoms to his cause, hoping to gather the resources he needs to reconquer the region. Okormir, just on the other side of the bay, was in fact the very first settlement ever built in Iobaria by Ulfin settlers. Okormir remains the most archetypical example of Ulfin architecture, with its log lodges, dragon poles at its wooden palisades, and the like. This city has seen resettlement many times, and its present residents increasingly grow weary of Prince Tsakiv Koria's empty promises of Orlov's return to greatness. Although nominally loyal to Prince Koria's rule, the citizens of Okormir also have their own leader, in the form of the druid king Algin, who worships an obscure giant god named Perbov, the father of the north, whose sweat is believed to have created the Lake of Mists and Veils. Closer to Orlov still, Franax was once a charming port that was known for its exceptional ship repair and building services. Its strategic location on protected bays and 3 islands allowed the port to expand significantly, but it has fallen on hard times since a terrible fire burned down most of the town. Finally, Orlendis is a town that has constantly risen from the ashes. While its significance to Franax and Orlov as a logging source for shipbuilding is diminished, lumber continues to be one of the town's primary products, along with small game pelts. Recently, the town has gained fame for its new lord, an exiled Galtan noble named Casrel Unilik. Thanks to his remarkable abilities and financial resources, Orlendis has become far more prosperous and defensible than ever before. The Watchtowers. Kask, Kirilthar, Hask, Ulthuran, and Fralros are 3 Cyclopean watchtowers that were built before the rise of human civilization in the region. Today, the first of these is a terrifying structure, haunted by malevolent wraiths. The second is occupied by a tribe of ogres and hill giants, and the third, also dubbed the Charred Watchtower, is the domain of Ashhags, drawn here by the violent arsons committed by the Great Horde. Lenusia. Lenusia was a settlement founded almost 4,000 years ago. However, it was abandoned when a plague claimed the lives of so many of the community's children. Since then, Lenusia, like many of the small independent villages in Iobaria, has served as a refuge for bandits. Mirnarosk. An independent and largely non-human city, the Komar, or mayor of Mirnarosk, is the dwarf Harsk Vladax, a werebear and head of a dwarven clan with more than a few lycanthropic members. The large number of lycanthropes and beastkin in the town is not actively discussed with outsiders, but neither is it explicitly hidden. Any travelers are treated as kindly as they act themselves. Those who take offense at or hunt lycanthropes should not expect to leave Mirnarosk easily, or indeed alive. Orost. Orost is another settlement that has remained independent, and is the sole secure rest stop for travelers en route from Orlov to Mernbay. So naturally, it has become a crucial site of escalating importance and conflict among the various factions vying for power in Iobaria. The town's central ruling Komar is housed in a massive structure made of wood and stone, built by humans over an ancient 2-ringed stone circle of massive size. The town has grown in size and defenses, resulting in a crude star shape. Orost attracts numerous envoys and representatives of the powerful from Orlov, Mernbay, Krydorn, and Veka. The local law enforcement authorities strive to safeguard the citizens from the battles and conspiracies among these visitors who seek to trade goods and obtain power. The Sirzemian Highlands. This central region of Iobaria includes 3 major human settlements, though they do not technically form an allied faction of any kind. Mishkar is a fiercely independent city that is friendly with the Finadar centaurs, and has allied with them in the past to ward off goblin attacks from the hills. Kyria is an ancient Cyclops city built high into the peaks of the mountains, currently under the control of the great druid Fedor Vasilk, whose circle of ancient Iobarian druids embrace 36 local nature gods who they refer to as the Children of Erastil. Finally, a little off the beaten path is the town of Everen. The kind but aged Councillor Pavla Trinar rules here, and she is generally regarded as the most powerful magic user in all of Iobaria, though because of her age, her score of apprentices help to keep the peace more so than she does directly. In addition to the 3 major human settlements, the Sirzemian Mountains are also home to Orosknir, the Eye Mount, as well as the haunted ruins of the logging village of Hroran, as well as the caverns of Perthos, a network of deep caves which serve as the winter homes of the Azorva tribe of centaurs. The more treacherous parts of these highlands are home to all manner of giants, trolls, and dragons as well. Katravish. Katravish is a small settlement with few inhabitants, primarily composed of mad druids. In reverence to their deity, the Cyclops god Praethos, also known as the Howling Eye, these druids gouge out one of their eyes and offer it as a sacrifice, expecting in return knowledge and wisdom. Despite their apparent insanity, they possess obscure abilities that enable them to locate and ensnare anyone who ventures into the woods near their settlement. Krydorn and its vassal cities of Volod and Vladimir. Krydorn, also known as Krydor's Cliff, is the second most powerful city in Iobaria, standing proudly on a sloping cliff at the edge of the Castrovan Sea. Its shining towers and lighthouse guide sailors on the sea. Despite being the second largest city in the region, Krydorn is constantly spoiling for a fight with any who criticize it. The current leader, Lord Buran of House Evius, is the 4th of his line to hold power here, and his greed leads him to envision himself as the future overlord of Iobaria, despite the fact that he has been easily manipulated for years by his ambitious council of advisors who outwit him at every turn. Buran's constant focus on boosting his own reputation and that of the city leaves many municipal decisions and services to others, resulting in unreliable services unless one is willing to pay a high price. Not far from Crydorn sits its sister city of Vladimir, which might have grown quite wealthy itself if it wasn't for its precarious position. The Faris River's delta, which surrounds it on all sides, provides many arable patches for crops, and the river also yields large amounts of precious metals, penned in many places along its length. Still, the lack of a protected port and the high waves of the Kastrovan Sea make Vladimir only a temporary stop for loading or unloading goods in good weather before most make sail for Crydorn itself to sell their wares. Finally, Crydorn's northernmost interest, Volod, is one of the more recent settlements in Iobaria, established only in the last 200 years as a replacement for the lost logging camps of Hrodan. For a significant portion of its history, the town has been associated with the logging and timber industries, which continue to dominate the trade in Volod. However, despite its conventional background, Volod has recently acquired a peculiar character, as druids settling in the town whisper that old gods have reawakened and demand the townspeople's worship. The Nivird Lake. This unnaturally warm lake is the location of Oroskir, also called the Opal Island. Oroskir is an enduring mystery. Likely constructed by the ancient Coloran Empire, its opalescent dome glows every night and crackles with energy, drawing lightning to it during storms. None have ever breached its shell to tell of the mysteries beneath it, though many assume it is the source of the warming waters of the Nivird. The cities of Antol and Veka can be found around the lake. Antol was once the capital city of Iobaria, but it is a much reduced shadow of its former self, having been ravaged by both disease and war. Arguably, though, it remains one of the most comfortable cities in all of Iobaria, as it stays insulated from the worst of the cold by the open and heated waters of the Nivird. Waters piped beneath the city, installed at New Iobaria's height when it was the capital from 3312 to 3679, keep many homes and businesses warm year-round. This is one of the very few cities not founded upon or near the ruins of a Cyclops city, and its primary draws today are its pearl and fishing trades, and its libraries of magical, religious, herbal, and medicinal lore, founded long before the Pathfinder Society ever breached its walls. It is, however, an occupied city. A battalion of troops sent from their sister town of Veka to supposedly help keep the peace, but actually to monitor the citizenry and prevent revolts against the bandit King Riul of Veka, ensure King Riul remains the de facto despot. Veka, though a smaller city than Antol, is the power base of Riul himself, the self-proclaimed Koffar of Nivird Lake. Riul has no trace of noble blood in his veins, but he hopes to ally with Prince Sakiv of House Koria in order to legitimize his claim to power here, or if that fails, to isolate the Nivird from the prince and preserve his own power through strength of arms. Vorsuli. A few accounts mention a great power in this majestic ruined city that emerges from the glacier and glows on rare nights deep within the ice. Some depraved druids in the area call this power the glacier god Reth, and make pilgrimages here to worship him. Ziovornor. Ziovornor is the domain of Ziovor. Ziovor is an ancient white dragon who claimed the northeastern ice steppes and the northern deep-run crevasse as his domain. An uncounted number of shattered dragon skeletons litter the cliffs and steppes throughout his glacial mountain lair, warnings to any foolhardy enough to approach. He is the eldest and strongest dragon to have survived the Drake Plague of 4519, and he has numerous servants in the region, both human and otherwise. Artosa, also known as the Three Who Watch. These three massive stone mesas are visible from many Iobarian cliffs, despite the distance. Crudely carved into the cliffs are three nude female humanoid figures of uncanny scale, their bodies at least half a mile long. While their race is unclear, the figures show a long-haired maiden, a pregnant matron, and a hunchbacked crone, each holding up a hand and warning the viewers away. Verniern. Although this city has changed hands a few times in its life, it is today the largest single centaur settlement in Iobaria, and it plays host to many conclaves of clan leaders every summer. It is the shared seat of power for the three Rishalka clans, with the city split among them into three zones of control. These three clans all share the Hoofwood as their territory and maintain a provisional alliance against the more ruthless Solniva centaurs to their north. Verniern also marks the northernmost reach of the Rishalka centaurs in Iobaria. Mavradia and Zradiniris. Mavradia was once a gem of Iobarian civilization, but the Drake Plague left much of it engulfed in wild magics. Great powers of flame, ice, and acid, and over 1/3 of the city crumbled in less than a day because of the battles among dragons seeking a rumored cure within the city's walls. Dragons, both living and undead, and the oozing deaths of Mevradia keep this once great city a dangerous place to visit. Similarly, Zradiniris, once a great cyclops and later a great human city, is now a deadly shambles of stone, magic, and danger. At least one family of dragons lives in the toppled tower ruins, watching the city and the crevasse to the east for their prey. Mern Bay. Tucked away in the southeastern corner of Iobaria is its largest and most intact city. Made fat on the trade with other Casman cities across the Castrovian Sea, this city is protected by sturdy palisades made of stone and wood, and enjoys the safety of a calm lagoon. Mern Bay is the liveliest and wealthiest city in Iobaria, and it boasts its highest population. The recent arrival of Galton nobles caused some disruption in the social and commercial order, but the situation has mostly been resolved, and the Galtons now control over 1/3 of the trade guilds. The nobles of Mern Bay, particularly House Rukov, hold their power carefully through complex alliances and strategies that seem incomprehensible even to seasoned politicians. House Rukov dominates the city by controlling the wizards and their magical colleges, while House Zigzagi has power over the military. Together they keep the other noble houses and the 5 Galton houses in check. Nevertheless, Lord Ivad of House Rukov is making deals and treaties at an alarming rate, with the aim of wresting power from Krydorn and Orlov and ruling Iobaria himself. He promises great rewards to his fellow nobles who support him, but few know if he can be trusted, or if he has any real chance at all of achieving his goals.